Most viewers think the hardest part of an Artemis mission is getting to the moon. It is not. For Orion, the most unforgiving part of the mission happens when everything looks almost finished. The crew has looped the moon. The deep space part of the mission is ending. The headlines are already writing themselves. And then comes the last exam. In roughly 11 minutes, Orion has to come out of deep space, hit a narrow entry profile, survive plasma and extreme heating, shed the right hardware in the right order, slow from hundreds of miles per hour to a survivable splashdown, and do all of it after the mission has already spent days or weeks consuming margin. That is why the trip home is not a victory lap. It is the final compression of the entire mission into one violent sequence. NASA's press kit can make the sequence sound clean. Service module separation, entry interface, plasma buildup, communications blackout, forward bay cover jettison, drogue parachutes, pilot parachutes, 3 massive main parachutes, splashdown. But those steps only sound simple when you list them without physics. Each one sits inside an environment that does not care how successful the rest of the mission was. That is the first thing this video has to make clear. Spaceflight does not end when the exploration phase ends. It ends when the spacecraft safely cashes out every design decision under the most unforgiving conditions of the return. That is why re-entry matters so much. Not because it looks dramatic, because it is brutally honest. Once Orion turns back toward Earth, engineering promises become thermal realities. At entry interface, Orion begins to feel Earth's atmosphere again at about 400,000 feet, or almost 76 miles above the planet. That sounds high. It is high. But from the capsule's perspective, it is the beginning of a transition from orbital mechanics to atmospheric punishment. The vehicle is no longer coasting through a forgiving vacuum environment. It is entering a regime where speed, angle, material behavior, and control authority all become linked. And linked systems are dangerous systems, because small deviations can travel. This is where the skip entry matters. Apollo made direct entry famous. Orion does something more complicated. NASA designed Orion to use a skip entry. The capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, uses drag and lift to bleed energy, then climbs back out briefly before re-entering again for the final descent. That approach extends landing range and gives recovery planners more flexibility. It is a modern answer to a modern vehicle problem. But flexibility is not the same thing as simplicity. A skip entry changes the thermal and structural environment the spacecraft experiences. And that is exactly why Artemis 1 mattered so much to Artemis 2. After the uncrewed Artemis 1 flight, NASA found more heat shield char loss than expected. In late 2024, the agency said it had identified the cause. Gas generated inside the AVCOAT ablative material did not vent the way models had expected in the skip entry environment. Pressure built up, cracks formed, and some of the charred outer material shed unevenly in multiple areas. That sentence is one of the most important in the entire Orion story. Not because it means the spacecraft failed. NASA's stated position is that Artemis 2 can still fly safely with operational changes to entry, but because it reminds us how little margin there is for misunderstanding the environment. Orion's heat shield is not a symbolic safety blanket. It is the piece of material standing between a crew and one of the harshest thermal transitions in the mission. NASA describes it as the world's largest ablative heat shield, about 16.5 feet in diameter. That size matters because Orion is not a tiny capsule returning from a low-energy trip. It is a deep space crew vehicle, designed to take the consequences of exploration seriously. And the heat shield's job is not simply to survive heat. It has to survive the right heat profile, in the right sequence, under conditions that preserve vehicle integrity all the way to parachute deployment. That is why the char loss investigation from Artemis 1 should not be treated as scandal bait. The stronger framing is more useful. Artemis 1 revealed a real behavior in the system. NASA tracked it to gas buildup in the avcoat during skip entry. And Artemis 2 is flying with that lesson in mind. That is exactly how serious programs are supposed to work. But serious does not mean easy. The heating environment is still brutal. NASA says Orion will see temperatures around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit during Artemis 2 re-entry. And during earlier testing, such as Exploration Flight Test 1, Orion faced even more extreme conditions, with heating around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the phase where the public sees a cinematic fireball, and the engineers see a countdown of thresholds. How the vehicle is oriented, how the boundary layer behaves, how the thermal protection responds, how guidance remains stable, how the vehicle exits blackout with the mission still structurally coherent. That blackout matters too. As plasma builds around the capsule, communications with the crew are temporarily blocked. Again, the public sees drama. The engineering meaning is sharper. This is the moment where the spacecraft and crew have to ride through one of the most consequential phases without ordinary communication. The mission cannot narrate its way out of the atmosphere. The design has to carry the burden. And that is why this phase feels so compressed psychologically. The spacecraft is doing a huge amount of work in a short amount of time with very little room for procedural slop. If the heat shield story is the first half of Orion's return truth, the parachute story is the second. Many viewers treat parachutes as the easy part. The fiery part is over. The capsule is slower. Now it just floats down. That is not how Orion works. Orion's parachute system is complex because the job is difficult. NASA says the full sequence involves 11 parachutes. At about 25,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deploy and slow the vehicle to roughly 307 miles per hour. At about 9,500 feet, pilot parachutes deploy to pull out the 3 main parachutes. Those 3 mains, each one about 116 feet wide, slow Orion from roughly 130 miles per hour to around 17 miles per hour for splashdown. That is an astonishing amount of kinetic energy management in a matter of minutes. And the key phrase there is in a matter of minutes. Reentry is a compression problem. The mission spends days building up to a sequence that must settle into the correct order very quickly. The forward bay cover has to leave. The drogue sequence has to initiate. The pilots have to do their job. The mains have to inflate properly. And the spacecraft has to arrive at the ocean, in a condition the crew and recovery teams can actually use. That is why countdown framing works so well for this topic. Orion's return really is a countdown, not just in clock time, but in options. At deep space cruise, you still have multiple ways to think about risk. By the time you are entering the atmosphere, risk has become sequence-dependent. One phase hands the vehicle to the next. The next phase hands it to the one after that. And there is very little space for one broken handoff not to affect the rest. That is what makes the last 11 minutes such a strong packaging engine. They concentrate mission truth. Success at the moon does not exempt the spacecraft from the atmosphere. A beautiful lunar loop does not reduce plasma temperature. A clean outward mission does not magically make parachute deployment trivial. The spacecraft still has to come home through one of the most punishing environments in the mission profile. This is also why Orion matters beyond Artemis alone. Return capability is not a side chapter in deep space exploration. It is one of the central design constraints for everything that comes before it. How much mass you can carry, how much thermal margin you preserve, how much exposure the crew can absorb before re-entry, how the mission architecture treats the final phase after months of operations. For Mars-class thinking, this matters even more. A crew coming back from Mars would not simply be riding a clean, fresh spacecraft into Earth's atmosphere after a short expedition. They would be returning after long exposure, long confinement, and accumulated mission wear, and then still depending on a sequence as unforgiving as this one to finish the job. That is why Orion's re-entry story is not just about Artemis. It is about the price of any serious human exploration program that promises people not just a frontier, but a safe return from it. There is another reason this final phase deserves more attention than it usually gets. Re-entry is where confidence is audited. Programs can sell launch power. They can sell destination graphics. They can sell the promise of the moon and the promise of Mars. But re-entry asks a far less glamorous question. When the vehicle is hot, partially blind, descending fast, and running out of phases, did the design really preserve enough margin? That is why engineers obsess over things viewers barely notice. Attitude stability, separation timing, thermal response, forward bay cover behavior, parachute sequencing, ocean recovery geometry. The public story of spaceflight ends in applause. The engineering story ends in a list of conditions that all had to remain true long enough for applause to be justified. That is what gives this sequence its power as a channel topic. It turns a mission that seems nearly complete into a visible reminder that spaceflight success is always conditional until the crew is actually home. And if Orion performs this sequence cleanly, it does more than finish one mission. It feeds credibility into every larger claim NASA wants to make about human exploration beyond the moon. And that is the part the public often skips. Going somewhere dramatic feels like the mission. In human spaceflight, coming home intact is part of the mission from the beginning. It shapes the vehicle. It shapes the timeline. It shapes what engineers worry about when everyone else is already celebrating. So what do the 11 minutes really decide? They decide whether the spacecraft can turn a successful exploration arc into a complete mission. They decide whether the heat shield's reality matches its promise. They decide whether the blackout is just a phase or the start of compounding trouble. They decide whether the parachute system cashes out years of testing under real conditions. And they decide whether a vehicle built for deep space crews can protect those crews all the way through the last violent transition between space and home. That is why the last 11 minutes matter so much. Not because Orion is fragile, because Orion is ambitious. And ambitious systems reveal their truth at the moments when they have the least room left to improvise. If you want space explained by consequence, subscribe. The next Threshold Atlas briefings will turn these same long-form stories into a tighter shorts funnel built around the most dangerous moments.